IVM.
I want to thank Intel for supporting our show. We're all loving working from home, but let's be honest, there are complications. For example, getting help from IT folks if your PC is down can be challenging because you can't just walk up to them anymore. Well, you'll be happy to hear that I have a solution for you, the Intel vPro platform. The platform comes packed with Intel Active Management technology that lets your IT teams remotely manage your systems and fix the problems without having to go to them. So it means more time getting your work done and less time spent on getting support. Visit intel.in/morewithvpro, that's VPRO, to discover how you can do more of what you want and less of what you don't. If you're listening on the IVM Podcast Android app, click the link that's visible to you now.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat. Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Kewalramani, and today I have with me Pranay, Kotasthane and Aditya Ramanathan. And we're going to be talking about a new research that they've published, which looks at national security preparedness and planning from an Indian perspective in the face of the pandemic, in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is going to be here with us for some time to come, for the foreseeable future, unless we get a vaccine and we get everybody vaccinated. But, and this sort of has created, the fact that the pandemic has existed has sort of hit our societies. It's created a set of threats, and they've done a document which looks at what these threats are, which categorizes them, which does a risk assessment, and then proposes some measures that India should be adopting in terms of its preparedness and planning in the light of these threats. So I want to first get to you guys to talk to you about how have you sort of conceptualized this nature of threats that India faces? Because what we've seen in the last 3-4 months is in the last week, we've seen this issue with China escalate into a different sort of level. And we've also seen sort of the migrant crisis and, some sort of law and order issues. So how have you conceptualized?
Right. Hi, Manoj. So it's quite pertinent that we are talking about this because we did mention in this paper about how there might be increased activity on LAC and LOC because of countries trying to take advantage of the fact that we are busy with another national effort for quite some time. So actually the motivation came from the fact that till now, the entire focus has been on economic risks and public health risks, right? Primarily public health risks, how do we get out of this pandemic? And then also the first order effects of because the economy has slowed down, what should we do to revive it? But beyond these two domains, what you will realize is that there's another sector where COVID-19 can have significant implications, and that is national security. Because there are sort of both first order and second order, third order effects. So look at the first order effect. For example, the direct effect you can see is that there might be absenteeism in police, or there might be loss of morale because they are at the front line of managing all this apart from what they were already doing before the pandemic, right? So that's a first order effect. They have national security risks because of loss of morale or absenteeism in police and other CAPFs or other forces. And then also there are second order effects. For example, COVID-19 lockdowns, and we are probably imagining there might be multiple lockdowns. So these lockdowns might lead to loss of jobs, and that loss of jobs might actually then lead to increase in crime or organized crime, lots of other things happening, which will again pose a significant national security risk. So that's why we thought it makes sense for us to look at specifically what are the risks generated in the national security area and what can we do to prepare better and how do we counter some of the threats that have already emerged.
All right. Aditya, I want to come to you because in your document, you've created a framework to assess different sets of risk, right? So there are high impact threats, there are low impact threats, there are high likelihood threats, low likelihood threats. I want you to sort of walk us through the framework of how do we conceptualize, let's say firstly from an internal law and order perspective, what is a high impact threat? And then we'll look at the external dimension.
Sure. I'll just step back for a second and also just say that this document is, like Pranay said, it's looking broadly at national security management, and it's doing so over about a 3-year period, because we don't assume that this pandemic is suddenly going to end all of a sudden. So even if, the most optimistic scenario, we get a vaccine quickly, getting that vaccine to enough people, returning to normal is a long process for a country like India. The other thing I'll just add is that there are a lot of scholars today who have a much more expansive definition of security and what they call non-traditional security threats and challenges. I don't necessarily dispute that, but for the purposes of this document, we have focused on a fairly traditional idea of what constitutes national security. So, like you were talking about law enforcement, our basic idea is that these are events that directly affect the ability of the state to exercise monopoly power over the legitimate use of force. So very, very traditional definition. This is to keep focus on some key issues. Now, as far as what is a high impact threat, I think I basically actually defined it right now. It's basically anything that affects the ability of the state to exercise its monopoly of force to ensure that broadly law and order is followed. And there are some key risks that we do identify that are high impact and high likelihood. And when we say high likelihood, we mean that these are actually especially likely to occur during this period of time, during the pandemic. So one is actually simply communal violence, so violence against disadvantaged sections. The other is, as Pranay touched upon, absenteeism or loss of morale in police forces. The third is actually misinformation, basically. So, pandemic like this both heightens anxieties as well as creates new sources of information, which are often not correct. And so, this can lead to, for instance, misinformation on food shortages, can basically lead to large gatherings, can lead to unrest. We've already seen some hints of this sometimes in our cities during the lockdown. So broadly, these would be the high impact, high likelihood risks that we see. There are also less likely risks. For example, we could just have large gatherings for some other reason that violate lockdown orders. We could also have, we do see that police forces especially are vulnerable to spread of infection. For example, we've seen this a lot, especially in Mumbai. Police personnel they don't just interact heavily with the general population. A lot of them, especially those in Central Armed Police Forces, live in communal spaces that are basically the perfect breeding ground for COVID-19. So those communal shared spaces are actually by themselves a big risk. And one consequence of this is simply that if people suspect that the people in uniform are infected, they may not cooperate with them. Law enforcement may simply become harder. The police may actually end up being seen as a threat rather than a help. Those would be broadly the high impact risks that we see strictly from law and order.
It's interesting. I was going through the document and I was looking at the external dimensions, sort of the national threats that you've spoken about. And the structure that you've outlined is precisely the same, that where, high impact threats are ones which affect the ability of the state to exercise monopoly over the legitimate use of force. What I found really interesting in the 2x2 that you have put together in the boxes is that you've got a high likelihood and high impact threat of land grab by China and of Pakistan and a standoff between the troops. And that's what we are seeing sort of play out currently right now.
No, I just want to add that we didn't get wise after the fact. We put that in long before this crisis.
Fair enough. But there's also sort of very other interesting components. So in that box of high likelihood and high impact, you've also got an economic downturn in the Gulf, which forces Indians to return. That's already sort of happened in some measure. There could be much more of this. And there's also the threat of sort of fake messaging by external actors. Could you sort of expand a little bit on some of these within this high impact and high likelihood region?
As far as that land grab by China and or Pakistan, in the case of Pakistan, it's, tensions with Pakistan is basically just another Tuesday. So I don't think there's much to explain there. In terms of China, there was especially among specialists people who really understand China better than I do, there's this impression that China would be stupid to go and get involved in a sort of scrape like this with India because it has enough on its plate, especially with the United States. But our instinct and, from our discussions with other people at Takshashila, we got the sense that this was still a high likelihood threat. If I was to summarize it very simply, our thinking was simply that this isn't Hu Jintao's China anymore. This is a different kind of China.
And I guess there is also a temporal element involved, right? Because China emerged out of this situation earlier than some other countries. Now there is again some spread in Beijing, etc. But so we thought that they might use that situation and especially what they're doing in South China Sea, etc. in other areas as well.
Exactly. There are a lot of people who say China is trying to divert attention from COVID-19. That's probably not true. China is just taking advantage of the fact that other countries are preoccupied with it. The other is, of course, Manoj, like you pointed out, the Gulf region. The Gulf region is in some trouble. Two countries, especially Turkey and Iran, have been very badly hit. Turkey has managed to, in a sense, flatten the curve. Iran is still struggling with COVID-19. Some of the other countries in the Gulf are really at the beginning of this crisis, and places like Yemen, which have been struck by civil war, which don't have any health infrastructure, it's going to get really bad. Now, what does this mean for the Indians living over there? You've already seen, for instance, Indian migrants, Indian expats who, for instance, work in construction, have been especially susceptible to infection for the same reason that we fear, for instance, police forces will be susceptible over here because they're living in these communal spaces. And what's going to happen is that a lot of people are going to have to return to India because there's a huge downturn in those countries. Why will there be a big downturn in the Gulf? Quite simply because oil prices are really low. And we're not likely to see, a huge spike in those oil prices. A lot of these countries are going to still struggle to balance their budgets. New projects are unlikely to be sanctioned anytime soon, given the pandemic. We are probably going to see a lot more Indians return. And, we'll have to figure out how to get them back safely. Now, this is actually the more benign part. The scarier scenario is that you actually have political unrest. You actually have violence, organized violence somewhere, and you really need to get those Indians back in a hostile environment. While that may be a less likely scenario, that's also something that we say that India should prepare for. As far as increased infiltration across the line of control is concerned, over here, we think that, this would be a perfect diversion for Pakistan, basically. And, Pakistan is also seeing a steep rise in cases of COVID-19. And, that's not likely to end anytime soon. The other is, we talked about how there could be misinformation during this crisis. We'll also see a lot of very deliberate disinformation campaigns. This will be both from parties within this country as well as from outside. I mean, if you are an adversary of India, this is a perfect opportunity to spread some chaos through fake messaging on social media, for example.
Yeah, I think we've already sort of seen some of the stuff, although not necessarily at the scale that we potentially can, but we've already seen some of the stuff that's been playing out, slightly different with what's happening with regard to China, right? With regard to death toll, with regard to what happened in Galwan and all of that. And then you can also add something about COVID, right? So, about the ability of the Indian state to handle this current crisis and how well or how badly we're doing this. It's sort of ripe for some of these things. I want to get to sort of the next section because you do then go into each of these risks that you identify. And you sort of look at preparedness actions and countermeasures that we can take. I want you to first sort of tell me, what is the conceptualization of preparedness actions and countermeasures? You've defined these differently. So let's just talk a little bit about what your definitions for these are.
Yeah. So we look at what are the generators of risks. So there is a single development can generate multiple risks. So for instance, if you have thinning out of state police forces, that can generate several risks. So you can have violence against minorities. You can have violations of lockdown orders. You can have attacks on doctors. Then you think, well, how do you prepare for these risks? That's a preparedness action. It's basically how do you prepare for it? And these are basically proactive steps, and they're meant to both reduce the likelihood of the risk materializing and also reduce its impact. So we talked about impact and likelihood. It's there to reduce both of them. And then you have reactive countermeasures, which are obvious. Once something has happened, how do you contain it? So, in terms of law and order, some of the big risks, some of the big generators of risks we see are, like I said, thinning down of state police forces because, they're deployed all over the place to enforce lockdowns because their own people are infected. And this in turn, say, causes absenteeism. There's also, problems, like I said, of misinformation, of basically political unrest, for example, amongst India's own neighbors. So one of the risks that we do identify as being potentially high impact is that if you have political instability in India's neighbors, you could see mass migrations into India. So, for instance, if the pandemic continues to spread in those countries, people at risk might just decide to go somewhere safer. There might be breakdowns in law and order. Basically, the same things that we fear in India. And so you could just have a lot of people coming into India, and we need to be prepared to deal with that. So that preparedness has to happen, before the contingency happens. So we lay down what are some of the actions that India can take.
No, all right. So, there's a big list, and I would rather people actually go and read the list because you've given such detailed countermeasures and preparedness actions that you've identified. And it'd be great if people can actually go and read the list because there's too many of them to sort of run through within this podcast. But I wanted to get at the big picture. You spoke about how you've looked at a period of 3 years, and you've then subsequently looked at the set of actions that you need to take depending on the kind of developments and the risks that they eventually create. And you've created sort of a short-term plan, a medium-term plan, and a long-term plan, which is your sort of overarching approach to this. I want you to talk us through the three sort of sets, and that will probably give people all the context, and they can then go and read the details within the document itself. So what's the short-term, medium-term, and long-term plans?
Yeah. So Manoj, before that, I thought we could just talk about a few interesting and really big risks that we are probably going to face. Sure. And for example, one big development which Aditya was mentioning was about police and thinning out of state police, right? So a lot of preparedness action needs to go there because we already know what the state of our police forces is. So we need to do things like, supplement state police with probably CAPF personnel or home guards, or standardize and issue a PPE kit for police personnel. And one thing that we should be doing is that the testing rates for our police forces should be even higher than what we are doing for the normal population, because they are really at the front line of a lot of these things. And along with the healthcare personnel, police are also at the front line. So if that is not adequate, then we are going to have a lot of other effects. So for example, if there is less police, we'll have increase in other crimes as well, and we'll not be able to enforce the lockdowns and other measures as well. So that's like really a key pivotal point for preparedness and countermeasures that we need to focus on. It requires a lot of state government collaboration as well. The other thing maybe Aditya wants to talk about this, but we want to think about raising an army of contact tracers under Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, to aid both general population and police. That is also really a key thing which will help us mitigate some of the risks that emanate. So these are some of the internal ones. Externally, I think a big preparedness action that we've probably already we are past that is this idea that we need to prepare for infiltration and things that are happening. And even on the LOC now, currently we are seeing a lot of things happening on the LAC, but LOC also we need to prepare for that, step up our intelligence efforts, especially to also address problems like the drug trafficking, etc., which might increase given that economy is down. So a lot of activity will move underground and those things might increase. So those are also areas that we want to focus on. Aditya, any other big ticket items that you want to mention?
Yeah, just on that, creating this sort of army of contact tracers, this is very much a sort of non-traditional security threat. Creating basically this whole group of people under Ministry of Health who can go out and actually find infected people, potentially infected people, help them figure out how to do quarantines, take people to hospital for treatment if necessary. And what we're saying is that this large group of people, we should also be able to create new groups of people, new little armies of contact tracers, for example, specifically to look at police forces. So you would need teams of both police personnel and contact tracers going out trying to see, how you can contain an outbreak within, for example, the CRPF, just as an example. So, you would not just look at their living spaces. You would also go back and look at who's that shopkeeper they met, go to their family, see if people need to be tested, if there are people who have symptoms, if there's somebody who's been exposed. So that contact tracing, especially for the police forces, is really important. They will also need to be tested at much higher rates. If people are infected, they will need to set up quarantine facilities for them. For other people, if a living space is infected, they will need to know how to very quickly disinfect it, make alternate accommodations. So, and you'll have to do all this while still being an effective force. So this requires a new kind of thinking. The other thing I'll add is, similarly, you do have a risk of sorts with the armed forces, with the military. Now, it's a lower order risk because they do not interact as much with the general population. But when there is an infection, there can be a high impact. So this is especially so with the Navy. We've already seen naval vessels in other countries really being taken out of business because infection has spread on them. And that risk does exist in India. Though already, a lot of precautions have been taken. People are being screened, they're being sequestered before they go on board. But this risk exists, and the armed forces will have to be very vigilant of this, not just now or 1 month from now, but really over the next 2 to 3 years.
All right. So let's now look at the big picture idea. What is your sort of plan? Like I said, you've proposed a plan of divided into 3 different phases. Can you sort of talk us through the plan that you've got?
Sure. So basically, as we discussed, a lot of these risks and developments have a temporal element to it. So some of these will fructify really quickly. Some of them might take some time to develop. So our risks, our preparedness and planning will also be different over time. So what we did is divided the measures that we should be taking into 3 broad time frames. So one is the short-term plan, which we need to do immediately from 0 to 3 months. So that includes things like focusing on domestic law enforcement, ensuring that various restrictions are observed, the risk that rise in small-scale crime is mitigated, and we should be really prepared for targeted violence against disadvantaged sections, because they might get labeled for the outbreak for one reason or the other. So those are the things that the police and our law and order forces need to be really focused on in the short term. Also, one big thing internally for the police forces, like we talked about, is increased testing rapidly in all our police forces as well. Now, coming to the medium term, which we define as 3 to 6 months, we need to look at mitigating some broader risks which are created by the pandemic. So this includes things like countering pervasive misinformation, either externally or which comes internally generated. Then also we need to ensure that CAPFs, the Central Armed Police Forces, retain their presence in critical parts in some of the insurgency affected areas, especially in the Northeast. So that needs to be a focus. And finally, in the long term, which we define as 6 to 3 years from now, we need to really get prepared for a difficult domestic and international environment. We've outlined some of the domestic risks, which are really national security, not just limited to economic or public health risks. So we need to prepare for that, increase vigilance along the LAC and LOC, even prepare for a renewed international pressure, which Beijing might apply at various multilateral fora. So that is an important point, and we need to plan for evacuating Indians from abroad in case of repeated outbreaks, especially from West Asia. So a lot of capacity building needs to go there. And finally, armed forces need to be able to cope with the long-term impact of economic downturn. For example, it might affect our modernization plans, it might affect our pension reimbursement things. So those are really big risks which might affect our monopoly or the legitimate use of force. So this is how we divide it.
All right. Aditya, any thoughts?
Yeah, just on the last point that Pranay made, while we have looked at only, say, a 2 to 3 year period, or say over the next maybe 5 years, the economic downturn in India is going to have a huge impact on military budget and, the ability to modernize our forces. So that will have a longer term impact on India well past the pandemic. And that is another thing that, of course, people in government are keenly aware of, but I hope that, our broader citizenry is also aware that we are going to be in for some difficult times, and we need to think very carefully about how we go about forced modernization in the next few years.
All right. Thank you so much, guys. This has been a fascinating conversation. There's so much ground that we've covered, and there's so many areas to look at from this point of view of national security. I think I'd sort of request people to actually go and read the document. There's lots of details in there, and we've just covered some of the bigger issues, but there are lots of details in there. Thank you so much, Aditya. Thank you so much, Pranay.
Thank you, Manoj.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money and Intel. We appreciate their support. It's been a fantastic week on the IVM network. I hope that you've been checking stuff out, but some of the highlights that you definitely should check out. Ashish Vidyarthi, host of Begin the Journey, was on Cyrus Says. They had a really fun conversation. I think you'll enjoy that. Uncle Please Sid did an episode around development, which was really, really fun. On Edges and Sledges, we had Adam Holyoke, former England captain. While those guys are killing it, one cricketer after the other. Definitely do check out Advertising is Dead. We talk about esports with some really guys who really know that space. Smile India, absolutely right. These guys are killing it as well. So is Pawan at Pragati. Don't forget The Original Things. Again, one of my favorite shows. You must check that out. And thanks for listening, and we hope to catch you again next week.
Namaskar, this is Ashish Vidyarthi. Yes, my friend, these are challenging times, but in these challenging times, we can create something extraordinary. Do take time to listen to my podcast, Begin the Journey. Available on the IVM Podcast, website, app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Remember, we have a great opportunity called life. Cheers.